Rosa, thank you very much for being with us. We really appreciate that you're out there working on this, stepping up and trying to look ahead at what may be facing us in this election season. I know it is rugged when you step into the civic arena these days, and you've had some tough pushback on this, but we appreciate you stepping up and trying to do the right thing here. Makes it all the more admirable that you're getting it done.
It's a pleasure to be here, Tom. Sorry about the technical difficulties. I'm glad to be here, and you can't not get involved in the world. Otherwise, you'd have a very boring and meaningless life.
Yeah, especially this year. I know you did this series of conversations, scenarios, you called them war games in June, which you may regret now because the right picked up on that, as if you're planning to make war on the elections. I think it's a very different reality. You were trying to look ahead at what may happen. It may seem like years ago when you sat down in June or July to do this with your group of 100 or so, but I wish you'd take us back to the scenarios you laid out and when you talked to these very experienced political players, national security people, political campaign operatives. Run us through. We'll be patient, and I hope you will too, but take us through the scenarios you envisioned and what you saw coming. I don't want to hide the conclusion. You said that chaos is likely, legal and political. Donald Trump, in most of these scenarios, is likely to contest the results, and that contesting would be legal and extra-legal, your scenarios found. That seems to open a very wide berth of actions. Take us through what you explored.
Let me actually take you back even further first to the origins of this project. I started thinking about these issues more than a year ago now. I was at a dinner party in Washington sometime, one of those big dinner parties with 100 people and name tags and, rubber chicken.
Washington.
Washington. And I was sitting at a table next to a federal appellate court judge and a whole bunch of, fancy DC lawyers. And the conversation turned to Donald Trump, as it does, especially in Washington. And we started talking about, oh, well, at least the election's coming, it's in a year. And I said, surprisingly, wow, what if Trump loses and he just won't leave? And the federal judge laughed and said, oh, and she sort of did a little, patted me on the shoulder and said, oh, don't be silly. That would never happen. That would never happen. The military would never let that happen. And then the other guy at the table said, oh, that would never happen. The Secret Service would never let that happen. Mm-hmm. And the conversation changed. But I kept thinking about this, and I was thinking several things. One was, oh boy, if we need the military to save American democracy, that's not good. Like, that's not a good thing. Yeah, you don't really have a democracy if the military is what, quote unquote, saves you. There's not much left to save. But two, I thought this is, people think of institutions as if they're magic, as if they exist outside of politics often. That there's this thing called the military, the Secret Service, or the courts, or whatever. And they just, oops, I've been told to get rid of my headphones, but they're not on, so I don't think it's that. It's just the universe interfering with me, which it does from time to time. They think of it, and people talk about, the so-called guardrails of democracy, as if there really were these sort of machines that just popped up, these guardrails at the appropriate moment to keep us safe if we need them, if something is going wrong. And yeah. I thought, to me, that doesn't really make sense. That institutions don't exist outside of politics. They're made up of human beings. When you actually start thinking, what would have to happen for, quote unquote, the Secret Service, meaning the human beings in the Secret Service, not let that happen? And the more I started thinking about it, the more I thought, I can't see that. I can't see that because it started seeming to me that the problem is not so much a clear Trump loss. The problem is some situation where there's just enough ambiguity that Trump can say, I didn't lose, I won. They were fake votes, it was fake news, it was a coup, whatever it may be. And then when you've got the President of the United States saying, I won, and the Attorney General saying he won, and the head of Homeland Security or the Secretary of Defense, or all the authorities saying he won, and you've got a bunch of people on the outside saying, no, but he didn't. And you're a Secret Service agent or whatever it may be, what are you going to do? It's really hard for me to see anyone in that situation saying, even though my boss and my boss's boss and my boss's boss's boss and my boss's boss's boss, that go on forever, say he's the president, I'm going to be the guy who says, sorry, sir, out you go.
Sure.
That was sort of the backstory. And what we did at first was just pull together some people to have a very informal conversation about, is it worth sitting down and trying to talk through some scenarios and do some exercises? And the value of what you call wargaming exercises, and it is a bad phrase, is that it actually, it's not my phrase. No, actually, we call them simulation exercises. But because it's not about a war. It's just, if they're just planning exercise, they're scenario-based planning exercises. Yes. And the value of these things is it actually forces people to think through, not just skip to the end where those guardrails magically come up, but to actually walk through, okay, if X happened, what would this actor do? What would that actor do in response? What would that actor do in response? What next? What next? What next? Well, how are you going to do that? What makes you think that's going to work? Yeah, how does this all work? And often it forces people to really confront their own assumptions, which are often, may turn out to be not based on that much. These exercises are totally artificial. The way we did is you assign people to teams. We tried as hard as we could to get people with real life experience that was relevant to the teams we were putting them on. So we obviously weren't going to invite Donald Trump and Joe Biden. Biden was not even the nominee at that point when we were beginning to think about it. But we tried to do the next best thing by getting participants who had senior positions in Republican presidential campaigns, senior positions in Democratic presidential campaigns, people who had held elected office or had worked in senior positions for others who had, that kind of thing. And we created, for all of the exercises we did, and I'll say more about each of those scenarios. We had a Trump campaign team. By the time we did the exercises in June, Biden was the presumptive Democratic nominee, so we had a Biden campaign team. We had a GOP elected officials team, a Democratic elected officials team, a team representing some civil servants, military, career civil servants, Justice Department, Homeland Security people. We had a media team with journalists and social media experts. We had a team playing...
Pretty good simulation of the Washington milieu that would be considering this.
Exactly. And the instructions to the teams were, we're going to give you a scenario and you're going to make moves in this exercise, and the moves should be designed to help you achieve your objectives. And so presumably the Trump campaign's objective is for Trump to stay in the White House and Biden's is to get the White House and so on. And then you're going to respond to the moves other teams make with your objectives in mind. And when you make a move, you have to articulate it in the form of, we're going to do X in order to achieve Y, and we think it's going to be successful because Z. Other players stepping out of role would then give some arguments about, yeah, they're probably going to be able to do that. That's totally likely, or no, that's very unlikely. That's a long shot.
Keep it real. Yeah.
A probability to the success of each move, and sometimes we would roll the dice. I've never actually played Dungeons and Dragons, but people who have tell me that this is embarrassingly that we were mimicking sort of nerdy games for all adolescents everywhere. But in any case, so we had 4 scenarios. One of them was modeled on the election of 2000, where you would have a period of extended uncertainty about the result, maybe even fundamental indeterminacy, where you're really never going to know for 100% sure who had the most votes.
2000, the chaos in Florida, the Supreme Court ultimately deciding that, Al Gore consenting, George W. Bush being named president.
Absolutely. So that was one scenario. And I should say, by the way, we deliberately chose not to look at the run-up to the election and the election itself. We thought enough other people were thinking about those issues. We decided we would look at the period between election night and inauguration. So another scenario was a narrow Biden win, where it looked like on election night Trump was ahead, but as the mail-in ballots began to be counted, it began to be clear that Biden was going to pull ahead narrowly in the Electoral College vote. A third scenario was a big Biden win, a sort of decisive landslide Biden win, and a fourth scenario was a Trump win very much like 2016 with an Electoral College decisive victory, but a popular vote loss. And just for fun, we threw in a somewhat larger popular vote loss than 2016. That is where we started with each of those scenarios. These were done by Zoom. Each one involved about 30, 40 people.
There was the Trump landslide scenario. I guess the polls don't suggest that that's coming at this point.
That's right. The four we did, and we started off thinking maybe we'll end up doing more after this. Maybe we'll do four and stop. We didn't really have a sense of how useful this was going to be. But our initial four, and we did end up stopping after that, were chosen because the election experts we consulted thought those were the most likely scenarios.
So Trump wins, Biden squeaks it out, Biden wins big, or it's ambiguous. These are your four scenarios. Did you find any of them ending peacefully?
It depends what you mean by peaceful. I mean, we were not trying to predict the future, and this is actually a really important thing to say. This kind of game does not predict the future. They explore some possible futures. And part of the reason we do this kind of exercises, the military does them, corporations do them, big nonprofits do them, is that you're trying to test your assumptions and discover what the risks are. So if you're in the military, you're thinking, we would win a war with China easily, and we could, beat Russia at the same time with our hands tied behind your back. And you go, oh, actually, that might be harder than we thought. We're not as prepared as we thought. It's not that you're predicting if it doesn't go well in the exercise that that's what's going to happen. The goal is to say, here are the vulnerabilities, here are the risks, so that you can identify ways to prevent them or mitigate them. And struggling over what the results were in all of our scenarios, both the campaigns sought to mobilize supporters to turn out into the streets as a show of support. In all of our scenarios, those protests and counter-protests became violent at least at the scale of Portland, Kenosha, etc. We weren't, I actually think a weakness of the way we set these exercises up, we didn't really have the ability or the right people. We hadn't set them up in a way that let us say, well, number one, what impact would that have on the politics if you had lots of people out in the streets and you had Kenosha times 10 or something? And we also we were neither set up to, and we didn't try to figure out kind of how bad could things get. Partly, honestly, because since our goal was to say, could they get bad? What could we figure out that could prevent them from getting bad between now and election day? There was no benefit to sort of seeing how bad they could get. Once they were bad, okay, that's bad. Stop.
Bad is bad.
That is bad. You don't need to play it all the way out to say, how catastrophic could this get? You were like, okay, now it's time to debrief and figure out what could have been done differently going on. But in all of the exercises, the campaigns began to fight about who had really won. In all of the exercises except the Trump victory one, well, actually, even in the Trump victory one, if I'm recalling correctly, they're all blurring together in my mind at this point, to be honest. Without looking at the notes again, they tend to blur together. The Trump campaign sought to stop the counting of mail-in ballots, discredit the mail-in ballots, claim that dead people had voted, illegal immigrants had voted, people had voted 10 times, all sorts of things. And they sought to do that both through legal means of going to court and trying to get counts halted, but also at times through extra legal means by doing things like attempting to get sympathetic state officials to simply stop the counting, attempting to get armed supporters to turn out and do things that would interfere with the counting. We had one scenario, for instance, where there were efforts to intimidate the poll workers counting the ballots through social media, through the presence of armed people outside, through chaos in the streets. In several of our scenarios, one side or the other, two cases, I think the Trump team, and in one case the Biden team, sought to exploit ideological differences within states where you'd have, for instance, a Democratic governor and a Republican legislature.
Of course, that's the situation in some very key states: Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, all states that have that situation, which can be very important when it comes to the Electoral College.
Yes, and so what we saw in several of our scenarios was that in two cases where the Trump team was down in the popular vote in those key swing states, they did rival slate of electors pledged to Trump to Congress for the Electoral College. And their argument was, well, you know, the governor says the slate should be pledged to Biden because the popular vote favored Biden, but the popular vote only favored Biden because we think those mail-in ballots were all fraudulent. And so the real will of the people was for Trump. And so we ask you, Republican legislature, to send a slate pledged to Trump. In one scenario, the opposite happened. It was a scenario in which thousands of ballots, mail-in ballots in a Democratic leaning zip code had been destroyed by an overzealous National Guard unit, which was murky in the game, whether they were destroyed out of confusion or out of partisanship or what. But in that case, the Democrats, when the Democrats made the argument that, hey, if those ballots hadn't been destroyed, Biden would clearly have won the popular vote. And so we call on you, state, to rectify that by sending a Biden pledge slate of electors. I'm not an election lawyer, and my friends who are assure me that I don't want to be one because the law governing presidential elections turns out to be incredibly convoluted and incredibly unclear. And
sadly, dangerously, as in this year.
Dangerously. And no one really quite knows what would happen. And there are all kinds of ways it could play out. I'm actually not the right person to sort of talk about all the twists and turns because it starts getting really detailed. But you could have, ultimately you could have an impasse in Congress, which is broken in a tie by Vice President Pence. You could also have Nancy Pelosi refusing to permit a joint session of Congress by simply not holding a legislative session for the House. So you can get all kinds of things where you could imagine a total impasse. And in several of our scenario exercises, we did get to that point. We got to the point where there was essentially a constitutional impasse with no obvious means of resolving it. And there was violent action and chaos at the street level. In several of our scenarios, President Trump successfully either federalized the National Guard or sent active duty troops into cities using the Insurrection Act. And again, we didn't try to play out when we got to these situations. We were like, oh, we have a constitutional impasse. We have violence in the street. We have troops in the street. Uh-oh. We didn't go, okay, well, does that tip over into some horrific conflict, or is there a compromise found? Because we were, as I said, our goal was to identify risks and identify ways to keep those bad scenarios from happening. So once we were at bad, we were like, all right, we're done. Let's debrief. Let's talk about, are there moments in that exercise where now that you see where it went, there are things that you could have or would have or should have done differently to prevent it from even getting that bad? Because bad enough was bad enough. We didn't need to get to catastrophic in order to say, wow, we don't want to go there.
And of course, a lot has happened since the midsummer when you were doing this. I'd like to bring in a couple of those factors. I mean, how much did you think about what's often called right-wing militia and the role they might play in Michigan? Now we have the sitting governor targeted, we're told, before the election in a way that she might have turned out to be a kind of hostage even. I don't know, if she lived till election day in that scenario. What role did you see for these armed actors, vigilantes?
Yeah, it's a great question. And again, it was certainly something that came up a lot in the games and in the debriefs, because when we finished each one, we would spend the next hour talking to people and saying sort of what just happened and what do you think might have happened and what could have been done differently. And it was certainly a worry that everyone had. And in all of the games, we had allies of the Trump campaign using social media in an effort to mobilize groups like that. And again, we weren't sort of the right people to play out well, would that happen? How much would it happen? How bad would it get? But it was a big worry. And I'll tell you, I feel like when I started talking about this, I told you everybody was sort of patting me on the head, like, Rosa, you're so paranoid and crazy. Don't be silly. Everything will be fine. And by the time we actually did this, I am paranoid, obviously, but sort of on the even paranoids have enemies. By the time we did these things in June, we were already, Kenosha was going on during this period. Lafayette's not Kenosha, I'm sorry, Lafayette Square had just happened. We were beginning to see these assaults on the post office and claims about mail-in ballots. We had seen Trump threaten to invoke the Insurrection Act over the racial justice protests. And we were beginning to see these sort of vigilante counter-protesters show up armed. We were seeing some looting and rioting and some evidence that there were provocateurs who were deliberately attending protests in the hopes of stirring things up. And I think that, since then, we've seen that more and more. And so the good news and the bad news is that many of the people who were originally saying, oh, come on, these things couldn't happen, are now saying, whoa, actually, there are some real risks here. That said, I actually in some ways feel kind of cheered by that. I mean, because not by the bad stuff that's happening, obviously, but by the effect it maybe will have. And this was, this was the goal of these games. The goal of these games was not to offer a prediction, this is what's going to happen. The goal of the games was to issue some warnings and a call to action to say, folks, if we are not careful, some really bad things could happen. Let's make sure they don't. And I think that the escalating attacks from Trump, baseless attacks on the legitimacy of mail-in ballots, the visible actions, just like yesterday, the exposure of this plot to, storm the Michigan State House, take hostages, kill police, kidnap the governor. I hope that maybe these things are pushing some folks who were a little bit flirting with, like those mask mandates, that governor, she's no good, or whatever, flirting with some of these right-wing extremist groups to go, oh boy, I don't want that. I don't want to go there. I don't want to go to things that involve violence and threats and risk getting arrested and sent to prison for the rest of my life. And, I don't want, when the president of the United States won't commit to the peaceful transfer of power, it's so shocking. It's just so stunning that maybe it really is a wake-up bell for a few people. I hope, that is my hope, that for all that the escalation is frightening, that it will also end up maybe being the thing that kind of wakes people up a little bit and says, you really don't want to go there. Let's dial this down.
If the president and his innermost crew are determined to go for broke, call it a fraud, call out vigilante supporters, even order law enforcement to take to the streets or mobilize the National Guard, if he's willing to do all that, where are the brakes?
Right. We're the brakes. Humans are the brakes. I mean, going back to that metaphor of the guardrails of democracy, there's no thing outside of humans. There's nothing that just pops up by magic. We are the brakes. You, me.
We think of institutions being prepared to kick into gear.
This is the thing, right?
We're all human, but how? What happens?
There's no such thing as an institution. It's made up of people, right? And that's what I'm saying. I mean, I'm saying that there's sort of no one magic solution here. This is not like, this one weird trick will save American democracy. It's a lot of different things done by a lot of different people that, if anything saves us, is going to save us. It's everything from voting, making sure you know how to vote correctly, ordinary people calling up their elected officials, whether their elected officials are Democrats or Republicans, and saying, I expect you to denounce efforts to claim that ballots cast by people like me don't count. I expect you to push back if somebody says that, even if it's the President of the United States. I expect you to use your influence and your power to make sure that the votes of every American who votes get counted. It involves things like pushing people at senior levels whether they are Mitch McConnell or the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff or the head of the Secret Service, to say, we will respect the outcome of the vote. And we also are not, you are not going to find us destroying ballots. It's not going to happen. You are not going to find us interfering. We believe that in a democracy, every vote counts. We are not going to lend ourselves to supporting the legitimacy of something that rests upon suppressing votes, intimidating voters, or not counting ballots. Because I mean, look, I'm a partisan. I'm a Democrat, right? This exercises we did were bipartisan. We had about as many Republicans as Democrats. I'm a Democrat. I don't like Donald Trump. I think he's dangerous to democracy. It's more than just ideology. I wouldn't like Mike Pence as president either, but Mike Pence is not crazy. If Mike Pence were president, I would not feel like, oh my God, I'm scared. Trump makes me scared. That said, I don't think nobody's going to change Donald Trump, right? There's not some morning where Trump is going to wake up, listen to an argument and go, oh, I really should stop attacking the legitimacy of mail-in ballots. That's wrong. It's unjustified, dangerous to democracy. Stop. That won't happen. Trump will be Trump, but the people around him, the people who enable him, from his core White House staff, to Ivanka and Jared, to Mitch McConnell, the Republican leaders in the Senate and the House, et cetera, to state level allies. Trump is one guy. He can't destroy democracy by himself. He can't destroy democracy unless a whole lot of people let him. And I think what we can do, what you can do, what I can do, what the people listening can do, is be saying loud and clear, you can't let that happen. Don't let that happen. You need to speak out now and say that's not going to happen. And I do hope that the conspiracy that was discovered against Michigan Governor Granholm will be a wake-up call even for some of those senior-level GOP people who've been really mealy-mouthed about this, saying things like, well, of course there will be a peaceful transfer of power, based on the outcome on Election Day, November 3rd. I think that's what Mitch McConnell said. He was careful not to say after all the ballots have been counted. He said, based on the election on Election Day. And we know that it's likely that we will have a final result, possible, but unlikely, on Election Day. It's people like him who need to be pushed to say, no, please be absolutely clear that the ballots cast by the American people will be counted.
Rosa, you talked about how a year ago you were the one raising alarm bells and the people around you, some were saying, oh, settle down, dear, it'll be all right. I feel a little bit in your shoes then right now, or at least feel compelled to explore the possibilities that there won't be this majestic assemblage of civic impulses that emerge and make everything right, that Mitch McConnell won't suddenly become less Mitch McConnell-like. We know that at a minimum, Trump has vigilantes that will respond to him. He has in Attorney General William Barr, a guy who's already proven he'll put armed forces without insignia out on the streets to enforce the president's view of the world. Where does the actual pushback come? Mark Milley, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, says the military won't be involved in this. If the president orders, as commander-in-chief, military active duty members to take to the street, did your scenario explore what may happen?
No, we didn't. And again, we got to the precipice. We got right up to the brink of things like that. And then we said, time to debrief. This is already so much worse, I think, than any of us ever want things to get. We don't need to see how bad. No, I mean, I think of course you're right, Tom, that there's no guarantee whatsoever that all the things I'm talking about will be successful. But there's nothing magic about saying, hey, the people, you and me, all of us do make a difference. It's not magic. It's just hard work. It's just making effort, and there's absolutely no guarantee it succeeds. There's no rule of history that says that peaceful democratic movements always prevail. Sometimes they don't, and there is no rule that says democracies last forever and empires last forever and good things, the moral arc of the universe does not always arc towards justice. Sometimes it arcs, very distinctly towards really crappy things happening. But that is, to me, that's...
We're having you talk this way.
Sorry. But to me, that's neither here nor... I mean, I'll tell you one thing for sure. If we all sit around and just cross our fingers, we increase the likelihood that it bends towards the crappiest outcome, right? I mean, you know, I can't guarantee that things turn out well, but I can sure tell you that if everybody just sits around and crawls under their beds, they're a whole lot more likely to turn out badly.
Well, we're just trying to get as real as we can. Your scenario planning has helped you and others think about this, so ordinary Americans can call their congressmen. But we know how Congress is laid out. It's incredibly polarized, hyper-polarized. We all watched the impeachment trial. We watched this, Rosa. I mean, part of what you described here is people coming into the streets. Now, this has been misconstrued by your right-wing critics as calling for a coup or a revolution, but everything is in weird circumstances here. What's the effect of people being on the streets? Let's say it's close or not close, but Donald Trump insists he won, that the election was a fraud. What's the role, really, of people in the streets? I'm sure there will be people in the streets.
Well, I mean, so it's ironic, actually. You know, one of the things we said was, yeah, if things get really bad, what do people who believe in democracy do? And we said, you know, at the end of the day, that is what they do. They turn out in the streets in large numbers and they stay there peacefully. And there is no guarantee of success. I'm seeing a mysterious little message to me on the bottom of my screen, but I can't actually read it because it's so...
It says we should both put our plugged-in headphones on. My headphones, my iPhone doesn't take a plug. I don't know about yours.
Same. I'll try
I've
with
got
my...
some feedback, and I don't know why.
I'm trying to bring my teetery bunch of board games.
I don't think it's a board game. It's for Tigo games. I don't think that's the issue.
I've got all kinds of good games here. I've got Connexy, I've got Pictionary, I've got the trouble is that if I breathe too hard, they're all going to fall over. It's like a metaphor for American democracy. No, I mean, think about. There is powerful and peaceful protest. There's power in peaceful protest. And protests don't always have to take the form of people being out in the streets, by the way. Another form protests can take are things like walkouts and, you know, things like, I mean, you say, yeah, Bill Barr is going to go with the president. Well, Bill Barr runs an agency that has thousands of career people who may not go along, who may say, you want to do that? I'm walking out. I'm not being part of it, you know. I'm not necessarily going out in the street and waving a sign and shouting, but you know, I'm not going to be part of you doing something that I think is unconstitutional. Goodbye, I'm leaving, I'm going home. You know, that is also a form of peaceful protest, a sort of non-cooperation. Yep. And the irony here is that, you know, we several people commented this is like an orange revolution, and the far right sort of seized on that and said, aha, this is proof that, you know, the left or Biden or Rosa.
Revolution in America, yeah.
Well, and I always thought, well, boy, that's actually conceding a whole lot. If you say we're outraged because we think the left is planning an orange revolution style action, because the thing about the so-called color revolutions, the hallmarks of the colored revolutions were, number one, they were against corrupt, repressive, anti-democratic regimes. Number two, they were peaceful. And sometimes peaceful protest sustained long enough does lead repressive, corrupt regimes to fold and make compromises. Not always, but sometimes. So if you say you're scared of an orange revolution, you're basically saying we're a bunch of authoritarian, corrupt thugs, and we're scared of peaceful protesters who are calling for democracy. Okay, you know.
We've seen massive demonstrations, peaceful, but an authoritarian leader decided he's going to be the leader again, no matter what.
I don't know. There are people who study this stuff. There's a really interesting political scientist at Harvard named Erica Chenoweth, for instance, who's written a book on nonviolent movements and when they succeed and when they fail. And also, I mean, the one positive thing she notes is that nonviolent resistance movements in the long term are more likely to be successful than violent resistance movements. But she has tried to get a better understanding of, well, what are the circumstances in which nonviolent movements do succeed. I'm not an expert on that, but what I can say, I mean, you asked, are we like Belarus? I'll tell you one thing that I think makes us different that worries me, right, is that we, or at least those of us, you know, our age, not 20-year-olds, we grew up learning that America was the greatest country on earth, that democracy is the greatest political system on earth. And we grew up at a moment when there was that sense of optimism that things were going up. Things were always going to go up. They were always going to get better. They'd always gotten better, and they always would get better. And I think that although the younger generation often doesn't share that optimism because they grew up in a darker time, that many Americans still do. And that in some ways is dangerous because it can make us blind to what is happening in our own country. It can lead us to say constantly, oh, that would never happen.
No,
and there,
things will be fine.
yeah, that things will always turn out fine. It couldn't happen here. And, I spent a big chunk of my career looking at societies where really horrific things happened, the Rwandas, the Bosnias, et cetera. And, I think what the people of Belarus know from their historical experience that many Americans don't know is that really bad things can happen. And they can happen, sometimes they do happen, that the good things don't happen by magic, that the good things require thousands upon thousands of ordinary people to take risks and work hard and be patient and recognize that this is not a matter of you go out and you wave your sign for a day and, Trump comes out and says, oh, I'm sorry, you're right, that this is maybe a matter of maybe it takes months, maybe it takes years, maybe it takes decades, that when bad things happen, they don't always, they can happen, they don't always go away fast, but that's not a reason to stop fighting against them. That's not a reason to give up on the hope that peaceful protests, nonviolent resistant movements can make a difference. They don't always, but they do sometimes.
I mean, there's no room here. What we're pushing for in this conversation is about the man in the White House and the claims he's already making. I mean, his party that's changed. A Republican senator just this week calling democracy rank, as in lowly, lousy, and reminding us we're a republic and be ready for the Electoral College and whatever it does. Wow, I mean, just see if it matches the popular vote. Realism requires that we look at that. And it scares me to sit here, even though I'm determined to stay in and totally on the front lines fighting for democracy. But what about the courts in your scenarios? The Supreme Court, does it come in as a savior or not?
The Supreme Court, I think, in our scenarios, the court sometimes at the lower court level ruled in favor of one or the other party, sometimes chose not to hear cases. My own view, at least of the Supreme Court, is regardless of whether Amy Coney Barrett is confirmed as a justice, I think the Supreme Court will try very, very hard to stay out of this. I think that there are enough institutionalists on the court who worry about the court's sort of long-term legitimacy that they really do not want the court for the second time in 2 decades to end up appearing to tip the balance in an election. That doesn't guarantee that they will stay out of it. I can imagine scenarios in which the court might feel like they had to get involved. But I would not start from the presumption that this is a court that wants to be involved. I think that they will try hard to just not take cases or to decide cases not on the merits and bump them back to political branches if they possibly can, or back down to lower courts for resolution. I think the court is a little bit less predictable than people think on these issues. My guess is that they will stay out of it. But if it ends up in court, I don't know what happens.
What about the military? You've had people in your scenarios envisioning what the impact the military might have, what role it might play. What about the sentiment within the U.S. military about being involved? As I said, Mark Milley has said they will not be part of this, but we know that the military has all kinds of political sentiments in its ranks.
Sure. No, I think the military, like the Supreme Court, is going to try really, really, really hard not to get drawn into this. And again, I can imagine situations in which, despite the strong desire on the part of senior leaders to stay out, that they do get sucked in. I can imagine scenarios in which actually take a step back, right? This is the problem in a sense. The problem is never things like illegal orders. What do you do if you are given an illegal order? Well, that's easy. if you're a military person, whether you're an officer or a person, you're given an order that's clearly illegal. You say, no, sir, or no, ma'am, as the case may be. I can't do that. That's an illegal order. The trouble is that people don't tend to couch their illegal orders as illegal orders. If somebody says, shoot those captive women and children, you say, no, 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 of course not. And somebody says, torture those prisoners, you say, no, of course not. But as we saw during the Bush administration, torture those prisoners doesn't come couched as torture those prisoners. It comes couched as, we're launching an enhanced program. And don't worry, it's not torture because the lawyers signed off on it and so on. And when you get that order, are you going to be the one who says, oh, well, even though you're telling me the lawyers say it's not torture and it's totally fine and it's a direct order, I'm going to say no, I'm going to risk my career? I think it's the same issue here in the sense that the situation in which the military gets sucked in is not a situation where President Trump says to Mark Milley, forget Mark Milley. Mark Milley's not in the chain of command, but where President Trump says to whoever the relevant person is at that moment, the NORTHCOM commander or whatever, I order you to, do whatever crazy and illegal thing. Easy one. No, sir. The problem is that the president says, well, Bill Barr over here, here's what I want you to do. And Bill Barr over here says it's fine. And you work for me and do you want to be court-martialed? Do you want to be fired? Do you want to be court-martialed? Ooh. Well, that's the hard situation. The other thing that I worry about with the military is not what senior officials do or say. It's the same thing I worry about with police and in terms of protests, for instance, that a lot of mischief and damaging things and bad things can be done by poorly trained people who panic. And if you get, for instance, National Guard units in chaotic situations on the street, imagine you have extremist right-wing militias, you have peaceful protesters, everything's going nuts, you're not quite sure who's in charge, have you been federalized, have you not been federalized, who's now supposed to be giving you orders. I worry more about Lieutenant so-and-so or Sergeant so-and-so who panic, and maybe use violence out of fear and lack of training, that neither the Guard nor active duty military are trained to do civilian crowd control in a First Amendment setting, or that they do something that is either is partisan in motivation or has a partisan impact and is viewed as partisan, again, maybe out of good faith action, maybe, so I can see all sorts of ways in which that sort of thing could happen. And on that, I think there are some concrete things that military leaders, law enforcement leaders can be doing now to minimize the likelihood. Number one is doing 10 times more of those important symbolic statements that say, this is a democracy. We don't resolve things by force. We don't have a role in this. No law enforcement personnel or military should ever be involved in destroying ballots or anything like that. Never, ever, ever, or preventing people from voting, or allowing others to prevent people from voting. We don't do that. We protect the democratic process, number one. But then number two, it's pushing training down through the ranks, especially focusing on Guard units and on whichever active duty military units are most likely to be called up if there is any kind of military support, civil authorities or Insurrection Act authority. And having that training be really scenario based, not just sort of like be good, don't be partisan, because people are like, okay, well, yeah, but what, but really sort of saying, okay, let's really think through, do exactly what we did with our exercises, right? Put people
Is that happening? We're 3 weeks away from Election Day. You've been coming out tangled up in blue. You're a reserve officer in the Washington, D.C. Metropolitan Police. Is that training happening? Is that message coming down?
Mm-hmm. So I think D.C. is actually kind of an exception, right? Because D.C. police do get a lot of training on First Amendment issues and crowd control. Just because D.C. is the nation's capital, there not a day goes by that there isn't some kind of protest. And so the D.C. police do get pretty decent training on, how to handle a protest, et cetera. I will note it was not the D.C. police in Lafayette Square. It was federal police and federal agents. But am I confident that that is happening in every major city in the nation? No. Am I confident that that is happening in Guard units? No, I'm not. we're getting close, but I don't think it's too late. I think it's sort of never too late. If it's November 2nd, it's still not too late. Do it then. But that's another thing that ordinary people can be saying to, calling the chief of police and saying, hey, are you doing this? Calling their city council. Hey, are the police doing this? Why not? Hey, calling the local National Guard officers in your state saying, are you training on this? Why not? That I think it's I'm sure it is happening to some extent in some places. I think it could and should be happening much, much more because, one of the military's, adages is, you fight like you train, which is to say that, the purpose of training is to sort of develop muscle memory so you're not in the middle of a chaotic situation for the very first time kind of going, oh, gee, I wonder what I should do now. This is a really confusing situation that ideally you've trained, and you've trained in a way that is scenario-based, in which you've, in training, faced confusing situations. It may not be exactly that, but we're enough like that, you're kind of like, oh yeah, okay. And if you don't train to, wow, what could happen if we're in a city in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and Florida, wherever, and this happened or that happened, what would we do? You ideally want to be thinking about those stuff before you're in the middle of the chaos.
We know democracy is not like tap water. We may want to assume that, but it's not. You can't just turn on the faucet and whoosh, it will flow out. How seriously is our democracy on the line in this election?
I think it is on the line. And, throughout this whole process, I feel like we've been walking a tightrope, and you don't want to be alarmist and say the sky is falling, because either then people dismiss you as crazy, or they hide under their beds and they don't vote and they don't do anything, or worse, they go crazy. They're like, my God, if there are right-wing militias, I should start a left-wing militia, or who knows what, right? So on one side, you have if you're too alarmist, you risk bad things happening. On the other side, if you are not alarmist enough, you risk people thinking, oh, everything will be fine. I don't need to do anything. And it's a really tricky tightrope, and I think it's one that we've all struggled with. How do you get that just right, where you're saying, worry enough that you are taking it really, really seriously and doing every responsible, constructive thing that you can, and be prepared that things might not work out, and you might need to be engaged in that kind of nonviolent protest for a really long time, and there's no guarantee that things end happily, but you have to do it anyway. How do you calibrate it so that is what people come away with? And I hope we're getting it right. It's hard, obviously, not least because none of us controls the media environment we're in, where for both, good reasons and bad reasons, what you say gets twisted and spun and so on. I do think we're at a moment of crisis. And I do think that how we all collectively behave in the next, not just 3 weeks, because it's not just going to be over on November 4th, but in the next few months really does determine whether we remain a genuine democracy or not. And I hope everything could be fine, by the way. Everything could be fine.
Yeah, let us pray.
Let us pray, right? There's nothing inevitable. And I said this earlier, but these exercises we did, they're not predictions. There is nothing inevitable about bad things happening. The metaphor I would use, or analogy, I can't remember the difference between a metaphor and an analogy, is if you said to me, how bad is COVID going to be by the end of January? How many Americans will have died? How bad is it? How likely is it that we'll have 500,000 Americans will have died of COVID by the end of January? Yeah. The answer to that is it depends what we do between now and then. You want to wear masks and listen to public health officials and so on. I can tell you the likelihood goes down. You want to just go to bars and go to concerts and go to football games and not wear a mask? Well, guess what? The likelihood that we get to 500,000 deaths goes way up.